Thank you, Lisa. My task is to give you a New Zealand perspective, including economic impacts and how effective I think our government may be at responding. Now, you've been in New Zealand a few days, so you'll know that when you mix politics with this, there are actually 4 million opinions and perspectives. So there's going to be a bit of me in this, but it comes from a year and a half of directing the New Zealand Antarctic Research Institute. It also comes from living in Dunedin, and we often joke, living in Dunedin, that when folks ask us about climate, that it is the Antarctic Riviera. But it's no joke. The icebergs really do sail past, visible from the city, as they spin out of the Antarctic circumpolar current. The same's true of our climate. At least in the south of the country, we lie within the westerly wind belt. That's at the northern boundary of the Antarctic polar vortex. It's those westerlies that bring the rain to the southwest of the country, though the pattern changes as one moves north along the 1,000-kilometre length of the country. There's endless variability as you go up and down the country as this dance plays out between the south and the north and the climate drivers from both directions. And we're as vulnerable as any other nation, as most other countries, to rising sea levels, coastline inundation, and probably, though, in our part of the world, I think increasing storm intensity on top of rising sea levels is going to be a challenge in this part of the world. So what about in 50 years' time? Well, one of the ideas that's been occupying my mind at the moment is how the westerly wind belt and the associated ocean currents and fronts will reorganise as the equator to pole temperature gradient diminishes with greater warming in the Antarctic. This idea, put forward by Robbie Togweiler a few years ago, is that the westerlies propagate south as you warm the planet. It prompts an interesting question as to whether the westerlies are coupled to the Antarctic circumpolar current and whether we'll see positive or negative feedback in atmospheric CO2 levels. But for New Zealand, I think we're simply more concerned with whether the rainfall will reduce in our big South Island farming areas and whether we'll see net migration from our southern fisheries. But let's put this in perspective. The net worth of our fishing industry is 1% of gross domestic product. In agriculture, it's not a great deal higher at 5% of GDP. So where's the real risk in our economy? Well, 30% of our GDP is in the insurance and business sectors, and another 10% of our GDP is in transport and communication. So 50 years out, New Zealand will be very focused on risk. Risk from more variable climate and increased storm intensity and frequency, and from rising sea level and coastal inundation, and the multiplier which that brings to storm impacts. According to the IPCC, 50 years out, we're probably looking at about 2 degrees global temperature increase and about 1 metre higher sea levels. Okay, I've rounded it to single numbers. But the real risk here is going to be to determine how the West Antarctic ice sheet will respond in a 2-degree warmer world. Paleoclimate tells us that the end game of a 2-degree warmer world is loss of the Ross Ice Shelf and the West Antarctic ice sheet. So it's probably more like 5 metres of sea level equivalent and atmospheric warming of 6 to 8 degrees in the Antarctic. Obviously that's going to have enormous impact on the equator to pole temperature gradient and the position of the westerly winds and the ocean front south of New Zealand. How does one address such risk? Well, the smoking gun I see is the stability of the big ice shelves that buffer the West Antarctic ice sheet and their interaction with the ocean. If you want to reduce long-term risk, work out how vulnerable those systems are going to be to warming. I've also been tasked with addressing how effective I think the New Zealand government will be at responding to those changes. 50 years in politics is a long time. They say that a week in politics is a long time, so I asked Chuck a little bit about this, and Chuck said I should stick a paper bag on my head and tell the truth. Okay, so no paper bag. I think we've got 3 big challenges in New Zealand. It's pretty hard to see that action in New Zealand on addressing the cause, that's greenhouse gas emissions, will make a significant amount of difference given our small population and emission profile. You know, it's something like 1% of some of the highest emitting nations. Though let's not get too carried away with ourselves. We still managed to increase our emissions by 20% over the last 20 years, if one excludes land use changes in forestry. Secondly, I think it's pretty hard to get traction on costly adaptation plans with such an insidious long-term problem, when we're mostly driven by our short-term political viewpoints. And in New Zealand, which is no exception, our politics seem to dictate what value and position we take on the environment. And thirdly, we seem to think that the short-term pain is not worth it for the long-term gain. So let's look at the pain angle for a minute. I don't think it's actually so much about pain, but changing long-established habits. How do we do it? Do we need a financial incentive? I thought about this. It might work, but I don't actually think so. In New Zealand, we've just gone through the switch from analogue to digital TV. And every household had to buy at least one new TV. That's on the order of $500 a household, or $1 billion for the country. No one complained. What was the incentive? Quality of the programs hasn't improved. Sorry, Lisa. Sorry. Yeah. I mean, everyone just accepted it. It's progress. It's a foregone conclusion. We just had to do it. We kind of seem to think that as long as we have enough money, we'll be able to provide for our immediate families and the next generation. But will we? Not when the risk of environmental change becomes too great, which unfortunately might be a few years off. The only way I see of engaging a nation such that its government will follow in some research is some research focused on two key elements of the Antarctic system. The bits that are vulnerable in a warming world, and the places with steep gradients in the physical and biological process where we can detect change early and engage people in doing something about it. And by change, I mean that propagating south to the Antarctic and that propagating north, which, for the purposes of this discussion, is New Zealand. And the sooner we get on with it, the sooner we can engage our and other nations in this difficult problem. And I know we have the capacity. After all, we did manage to establish the Earthquake and War Damage Commission 70 years ago and generate a fund that's made a significant difference in dealing with earthquake risk and rebuild. Thanks.